On September 28, 2022, a wall of water between 10 and 15 feet high swept across Fort Myers Beach in minutes. It did not rise gradually. It arrived like a moving cliff, lifting homes from their foundations and submerging an entire island community under water that reached the rooftops. Hurricane Ian's winds were 150 miles per hour. But it was the water that killed. Of the 149 people who died in Florida, the majority drowned. The storm that would eventually destroy Fort Myers Beach began as a tropical wave off the African coast in mid-September 2022. It entered the Caribbean Sea on September 18 and began to organize under warm sea surface temperatures and low wind shear. The 2022 hurricane season had been unusually quiet through August, with not a single named storm forming that month, a rarity in the satellite era. That quiet was misleading. The atmospheric conditions that had suppressed activity earlier in the season did not eliminate the heat energy stored in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. When Ian entered those waters, it found fuel that had been accumulating for months. The storm crossed western Cuba on September 27 as a Category 3 hurricane, causing significant damage and leaving the entire country without power. But what happened after Cuba defined Ian's place in history? As the storm entered the Gulf of Mexico, it encountered sea surface temperatures that were running well above average and a layer of warm water that extended deep beneath the surface. Ian's response was rapid and dramatic. In the 3 hours before landfall on September 28, the storm intensified by 35 miles per hour, a rate that exceeded what the National Hurricane Center's intensity forecasts had anticipated. Ian arrived at the coast of southwest Florida as a high-end Category 4 hurricane, just shy of the Category 5 threshold, with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 940 millibars. The track of the storm was consequential in ways that compounded the surge threat. Ian made landfall near Cayo Costa, a barrier island just north of Captiva Island, and its center moved inland near the mouth of the Peace River. This track placed Fort Myers Beach directly in the northeastern quadrant of the storm, the most dangerous position relative to the eye wall. The onshore flow from the southeastern side of a hurricane rotating counterclockwise drives water toward the coast with maximum force, and the orientation of southwest Florida's coastline, curving inward at Charlotte Harbor and Pine Island Sound, created a geometry that funneled the surge directly into the communities of Lee County. Fort Myers Beach, situated on a narrow barrier island that rises only 2 to 3 feet above sea level at most, had no elevation to absorb what was coming. Storm surge is the deadliest consequence of a major hurricane, and it is also the least understood by the public. Unlike floodwaters from rain, which rise slowly enough to allow some reaction time, storm surge arrives with the speed and force of the storm that drives it. The surge is not a wave in the conventional sense. It is a rise in the overall water level of the ocean, pushed ahead of the storm's rotating winds that moves onshore as a coherent mass of water. What makes storm surge particularly lethal in structures is that it does not behave like a flood. It behaves like a river, moving with force and momentum, carrying debris, vehicles, and entire buildings in the direction of its flow. Structures that might survive flooding from rainfall can be moved from their foundations entirely by surge. In Fort Myers Beach, the surge did not creep over the seawall. It swept across the island as a continuous body of moving water. Residents who had stayed on their second floors found the surge reaching their ceilings. Those who had stayed on their first floors found themselves underwater with almost no warning between the moment the water entered their homes and the moment it reached lethal depth. The National Hurricane Center had forecast surge of 12 to 16 feet for the most exposed sections of coast between Inglewood and Bonita Beach, the precise stretch of coastline that included Fort Myers Beach. This was a forecast of catastrophic inundation, communicated in the clearest possible language available to forecasters. Despite that warning, evacuation compliance in Lee County was insufficient. In the days before landfall, the storm's track had been somewhat uncertain, with many models initially suggesting a path further north toward Tampa. As the track shifted south toward Lee County in the 48 to 72 hours before landfall, evacuation orders were issued. but a significant portion of the population in the highest risk zones chose to shelter in place. Many residents, particularly on Fort Myers Beach, had lived through previous hurricanes and storms that had not produced the surge levels forecasters warned about. That history of near misses created a false sense of security that Ian shattered in hours. The question of whether Lee County officials issued mandatory evacuation orders early enough became a point of significant public controversy in the weeks after the storm, with investigations examining the timeline of decisions against the timeline of the storm's track shifting toward the county. The broader pattern of evacuation non-compliance in high surge risk zones, a documented challenge in hurricane preparedness for decades, produced some of the most heartbreaking individual stories of Ian's death toll. People who had survived a dozen storms in the same house and did not survive this one. Ian made landfall at 3:05 in the afternoon on September 28. The eye wall came ashore with the full force of a mature, intensely organized hurricane. Wind gusts at landfall reached or exceeded 155 miles per hour. In Fort Myers Beach, the surge that arrived with the eye wall was measured at between 10 and 15 feet above ground level. A pressure sensor mounted on the Fort Myers Beach pier recorded a storm tide reaching approximately 13 feet above the pre-storm beach elevation, with wave action pushing water levels to 15 feet at peak. The beach itself was scoured by the force of the waves, losing approximately 5 feet of sand depth from pre-storm levels. The island, which had existed as a continuous strip of hotels, restaurants, homes, and businesses, was reduced in hours to a landscape of bare foundations, twisted metal, and debris fields that stretched for miles. The scale of the destruction in Lee County was without precedent in the modern history of Southwest Florida. Approximately 5,000 homes in Florida were destroyed, and 30,000 were damaged. In Fort Myers Beach alone, 97% of all structures were damaged or destroyed, a figure that, when stated plainly, is difficult to fully comprehend. It means that of every 100 buildings on the island before the storm, 97 were either gone or so severely damaged as to be uninhabitable. The storm displaced approximately 7,000 boats, many of which were lifted by the surge and deposited in streets, parking lots, and on top of other structures. The Matanzas Pass Bridge, the primary road connection between the mainland and Fort Myers Beach, was damaged and impassable in the immediate aftermath, cutting the island off from emergency access for critical hours. The historic pier at Fort Myers Beach, a landmark of the community for decades, was completely destroyed by the surge. The Times Square area at the northern end of the island, where the island's tourism and commercial life had been concentrated for generations, was obliterated. A stretch of Estero Boulevard that had been lined with restaurants, vacation rentals, and businesses was reduced to scattered concrete slabs. Sanibel Island, connected to the mainland by a causeway that Ian destroyed in 3 places, was similarly cut off. The causeway closure left Sanibel's roughly 6,500 year-round residents accessible only by air or boat for weeks, and the island's infrastructure sustained damage of a scope that made full recovery a multi-year undertaking. The emergency response that followed the storm was among the largest in Florida's history. More than 1,000 people were rescued from flooded structures in Lee County alone in the first 2 days following landfall. The National Guard conducted aerial rescues from rooftops across the county. Coast Guard helicopters flew continuous sorties over Fort Myers Beach and the surrounding barrier islands, lifting people from rooftops and upper floors where they had survived the surge by the narrowest of margins. More than 42,000 National Guard personnel were mobilized across Florida. Search and rescue teams from across the country, including urban search and rescue task forces from Virginia, Florida, and other states, were deployed to sift through the debris fields of Fort Myers Beach looking for survivors, and increasingly, as the days passed, for victims. President Biden declared a major disaster for Florida within 24 hours of landfall and traveled to the affected area the following week, touring the devastation alongside Governor Ron DeSantis. FEMA pre-positioned supplies and personnel before landfall and activated its incident management structure before the storm made landfall, applying lessons from the Katrina era about the consequences of reactive rather than proactive federal disaster response. The death toll climbed steadily in the days after the storm as floodwaters receded and search teams reached areas that had been inaccessible. The final count of storm-related deaths in Florida reached 149, with the majority concentrated in Lee County. Of those deaths, at least 58 were confirmed drownings in storm surge. Additional deaths in North Carolina, where Ian made a final U.S. landfall as a weakened storm on September 30, brought the total U.S. death toll to approximately 157. The concentration of deaths in Lee County, and specifically the number of people who drowned in their own homes in mandatory evacuation zones, prompted investigations into the timing and communication of evacuation orders. Ian's financial toll was staggering. Preliminary estimates from NOAA placed the damage at more than $50 billion. Private insurance estimates reached or exceeded $100 billion when the full scope of structural, infrastructure, and economic losses were assessed. Ian became one of the costliest natural disasters in American history, joining Katrina, Harvey, and Maria in a category of hurricanes whose damage fundamentally altered the insurance and recovery landscape of the affected region. The Lee County insurance market, already stressed by years of litigation and rising premiums, was pushed to a breaking point that accelerated the ongoing instability of Florida's property insurance sector. The rapid intensification Ian exhibited in the hours before landfall became one of the most studied aspects of the storm in the years that followed. The storm's 35-mile-per-hour intensification in 3 hours, on top of already high-end Category 4 winds, exceeded what operational forecast models had confidently predicted. This was not unique to Ian. In the years preceding 2022, a pattern of rapid intensification events in the Gulf of Mexico had been documented, driven in part by rising sea surface temperatures and increasing ocean heat content at depth. The warm water layer that Ian drew on in the Gulf was not a shallow surface feature, but extended well below the mixed layer, providing sustained energy transfer even as the storm's circulation drew up deeper water. Researchers studying Ian's intensification contributed to an ongoing effort to improve rapid intensification prediction, one of the most consequential unsolved problems in hurricane forecasting. The legacy of Ian on Fort Myers Beach has been long and complicated. The island's recovery has proceeded in stages, shaped by the scale of the destruction, the complexity of the insurance claims process, and the fundamental question of how and whether to rebuild in a location that had been this comprehensively destroyed by storm surge. Many residents who lost their homes have not returned. Some have chosen to rebuild, taking advantage of updated construction standards and elevated foundations. The commercial core of the island, the restaurants and shops and hotels that had defined Fort Myers Beach as a tourist destination, has required years of reconstruction. As of 2026, the island is in a state of ongoing rebuilding, with some sections recovered and others still bearing the marks of what the surge did in the space of a single afternoon on September 28, 2022. Ian's name was retired by the World Meteorological Organization and will never be used again for an Atlantic storm. The storm it named lasted less than a day over southwest Florida. The consequences of those hours will be visible for decades.